No Heroes Here, A Father's Journal. Written by Joseph Doty. Compiled and edited by Scott and Mary Ann Doty.
This audiobook initially consisted of more than 100 typewritten pages. I remember seeing my father typing away on a manual typewriter in the finished basement of my childhood home. Later, when Dunny handed out copies to his adult children, I briefed through my copy but, regretfully, paid little more attention to it until I retired. By that time, my father had passed away. I never got the chance to talk to him about his story. Surprisingly, I discovered it was not just a loose collection of memories as I initially thought it would be. What he had done was write a compelling and fascinating story of his time in Italy during the Italian campaign in World War II, a harrowing tale of deadly combat and life-threatening injuries, revealing a tapestry of resilience and camaraderie that defined a generation on the front lines of history. I used a computer program that translated every typed word into a document that could be edited on the computer. I enlisted the help of my wife, Mary Ann, in editing the document for clarity. Once done, we used a computer program that helped to correct punctuation, tenses, and sentence structure. To convert it to an audiobook, I found a program that translated the document into spoken words. I wanted to use a sample of my father's voice. I was sad to discover that despite many home movies, my father rarely spoke. Instead, I used a sample of my voice, as I was told it was very similar to my dad's. I started this process in 2000, finalized the written copy in 2023, and converted it into an audiobook completed in 2024. COVID-19, a stroke, and other life events have delayed our work. Chapter 1. Burdened with a backpack, duffel bag, helmet, and rifle, I stared with excited apprehension at the superstructure of a large ship towering above the roof of a loading dock in North Carolina. We had just disembarked from a troop train that had carried us from Camp Meade, Maryland, to this point. The trip had taken a full day and night, as no creature comforts were available. We were all tired, dirty, and smelled. We had little or no idea where we were going when we boarded the train. Rumors ran rampant. Every point on Earth was guessed at, but now the guessing was over. We were on our way to Europe. A light but persistent rain was falling as we unloaded. It went ignored, even though it increased in intensity. We shuffled forward in a rapidly diminishing line toward the ship into whose bowels we would disappear, not to be seen again for 9 days. Fear gnawed away at my self-confidence as the line of men in front of me grew shorter. I felt ill. The weight of my equipment has now grown heavier with rain, seeming unbearable. I imagined a scene at the foot of the gangplank. At the last possible moment, they would discover I was there due to a clerical error. I would not have to follow the man in front of me up the gangplank into the gaping hole in the ship's side. When my turn came and asked to state my name and serial number, I found I could answer with a degree of firmness. Doty, 201452914. But was this me going up the gangplank of a troop ship? About now the movie should be coming to an end, but it was just beginning. Chapter 2. Floating across the Atlantic Ocean on a bubble of air supported by a thin metal skin could be considered exciting. But to me it is close to terrifying. Of course I was seasick. Not as bad as some, but worse than others. To make my matters worse, I was assigned to a detail responsible for cleaning the head, latrine in Army parlance, 3 times daily. My compatriots and I risked drowning in a river of filth as we unclogged clogged-up drains and urinals. The most depressing part was the knowledge that 1,000 soldiers waited outside the locked doors, anxious to get in and start the dreary routine all over again. I felt sorry for the unfortunate men whose bunks lined the aisle leading to the head. If anyone lived a precarious life, it was they. There were 3 events or experiences on that trip I will not forget for the rest of my natural days. First, who could forget a 9-day bout of seasickness? Not me. The second was the miserable detail of sweeping the decks. I will always grimly remember the Navy term, sweepers, man your brooms. This meant to give the ship a good clean sweep down both fore and aft. Sweep down all lower decks, ladder backs, and passageways. Dump all garbage clear of the fantail. The third, and to me, the topping of the whole trip, occurred on the morning of what was to be the last day at sea. I had decided I must eat something. Reluctantly, I went to breakfast. Not at all sure of the outcome, the thought of a bowl of cereal seemed so good that it gave me the strength to keep my place in line. Others with less determination found it necessary to leave. Imagine my horror not to be served a civilized breakfast of cereal, but a bowl of chili con carne. I stood watching that glop slosh back and forth across my aluminum tray and knew I could not eat it if it meant the end of the war. I stood there mentally retching, brought suddenly to awareness by the forceful beating of a hand across my back. I turned, hands instinctively raised to protect myself. I could hardly believe my eyes. It was Andy from the neighborhood, and we had gone to school together. We had played ball on the same team and done many things that only good friends could do together. Andy told me we would be docking at Casablanca, North Africa, within the next 2 to 3 hours, proving wrong to many of us that we were Europe-bound. Andy was cruel enough to tell me he could have fixed me up with seasick pills if only he had known I was aboard. Crueler yet, he could have supplied me with some decent food like candy and fruit. Our reunion was short-lived, as he was soon called to duty. I was left with his good wishes and my bowl of chili, which I did not eat. As we debarked from the troop ship, a group of wounded were being carried aboard a hospital ship at an adjoining dock. Even that sobering sight could not dampen our spirits, now at a high level at being released from our misery. We were driven through Casablanca to a small camp just outside the city. The camp had little about it to arouse memories, although I do recall it had a well-stocked canteen. It was a pleasure to fill my kit bag with as much candy and gum as I chose to buy. What it did not have was what I needed most, a strong mouthwash. I had a 9-day taste in my mouth that I thought would never go away. The novelty of being in a desert region soon wore off, and I soon came to detest the wind-driven sand. It was always in our eyes and ears, and we ate it in our mouths. A few hikes were on our agenda, but I did not mind them at all. The weather was nice, and the countryside was attractive, if a little uncomfortable, for those with sensitive noses. Whatever the locals used for fertilizer did not come out of a sack from a local feed and grain store. One day, we were given a treat as an afternoon hike brought us to a beach on the Mediterranean Sea. When we arrived at the beach and prepared to swim, we placed our clothes in neat, orderly lines. It was great to go in that warm water and splash and swim to our heart's content. Our brief vacation was soon over. Once again, we had to clothe ourselves in our brown khaki uniforms, effectively removing all individuality from us. As we were dressing, it was noticed one set of clothing had not been claimed by its owner. 200 or 300 yards offshore were a once proud freighter's many-holed, half-submerged hulk. Disregarding the warning of strong currents, one of us had attempted to swim out to the sunken freighter, and apparently he drowned. Friends of the missing man requested permission to stay and continue to search for him. Given it, they huddled around the pile of clothes as if by doing so they could bring solace to their lost friend. As we climbed the hill bordering the beach, I looked back, and the shadows of the silent group, lengthened by the setting sun, looked very sad indeed. On what turned out to be our last day in that camp, we hiked out to a town named, I believe, St. Joe. It did not seem possible that this warm, sunny, rural town had been the scene of one of the most hotly contested battles of the North African campaign. However, there were few signs of it, and it was tempting to make believe it had never happened. Chapter 3. The next day we packed our gear. We left Casablanca to travel by rail across the Atlas Mountains to our next destination, or ran. To say we moved by rail is to glamorize the way we did travel. There were rails, all right, but any other similarity to travel in the States was accidental. Our boxcars were what they called in World War I 40 and 8s, that is, 40 men or 8 head of cattle. If the boxcars assigned to us were not in use during the last war, they surely were soon after. We stood around and waited for a work gang of Arabs to clean the floor as best as possible. We made jokes about our fate. Some of the remarks were so funny, and we laughed about it so much that we did not mind when our turn came to get on board. When on board, it became apparent that the work gang thought less about hygiene than we did, and we had to get off again and clean the car to our satisfaction. Straw was distributed for the floor, and we finally had a reasonably clean traveling home. Underway, we settled ourselves as best we could. Although more fortunate than our brothers of the First World War, we had only 28 enlisted men and 1 officer per car. However, it was still plenty crowded, considering we had all our baggage with us, plus rations for a 3-day trip. We did not have room for anything else, much less hygiene. At whatever station we stopped, we all unboarded to relieve ourselves along the trackside and take on water when available, which, of course, we boiled before using. We boiled the water over small gasoline stoves, which was almost as dangerous as not boiling the water. The straw covering the floor seemed most anxious to catch fire. We had to put out a fire twice. At least one of the many boxcars that made up the train appeared to be issuing smoke all day. The scenery was awe-inspiring once we got up into the mountains. Sunrises were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I remember a morning looking down into a valley still in darkness as we traveled in early daylight along the face of a cliff as jagged as a picnic can. Each wayside station, no matter how small, had a full complement of souvenir hawkers, beggars, and local farmers selling fruit. Some handicrafts were outstanding. The figs and oranges were delicious. We bought all they had to sell. There is a town I remember, perhaps incorrectly, named St. Cloud in Algeria, somewhere between Casablanca and Oran. Chapter 4. During the second night of our trip, we suffered a train accident in this North African town, the nature of which has stuck in my mind forever. I do not recall how many boxcars were involved, but I certainly remember the boxcar's circumstances. Our boxcar had turned over and dragged for some distance. Some of the following boxcars jumped the tracks, and the passengers bumped around a bit. No one was hurt to any extent in those boxcars. I had awakened to a loud roaring noise that startled me at first, but I thought we were only going over a bridge. I remembered that the same noise frightened me on the first night of the trip. As I was shaken fully awake, I became aware of the cries of fear as our car turned over. Near to me, a voice called, "My leg! Oh God, my leg!" Others were okay, calling to their friends to offer help. The car came to a stop lying on its side. Fortunately, the doors were closed. Several of us would inevitably have been thrown out if they had not been. I lay pinned into a forward corner of the car. The crushing weight of men and luggage precluding any escape on my own, I thought I would suffocate. I'm sure it was only for a minute or two, but it seemed like forever before I and several others were pulled out. The electric line supplying power for the train engine had broken, cascading sparks into the car and setting fire to the straw covering the floor. Blue-white flashes illuminated the scene. While pinned in the corner, I was very close to the man who had injured his leg. He had been thrown up against and partially through the barred window at that end of the boxcar. Somehow, his leg had gone between the bars, and when the car toppled over, it fell on his leg. I was finally out of the car and checking for scratches and bruises. I seemed to be all right. Help arrived from the nearby town, and the injured were being taken care of. I decided to return to my boxcar for my duffel bag. In the shadow of the boxcar, I noticed the lieutenant assigned to my boxcar. He was kneeling and bent forward so that his forehead was touching the ground. As I approached him, I asked if he was all right. Seemingly waiting for the sound of a concerned voice, he then rolled over to his back. I knelt by his side, and noticing a sweater lying nearby, I rolled it up and put it under his head. He told me he was afraid he was injured internally. I got the attention of 2 Red Cross people, and they came over to take care of him. I climbed back into the car and managed to locate my bag. I threw it out of a hole made in the boxcar's roof and crawled out after it. In doing so, I got some blood on my hands and face. A Red Cross worker saw me emerging from the hole and, thinking I was injured, tried to put me in an ambulance. I did not notice until later in the morning that a splinter of wood penetrated my duffel bag, which I'd been using as a pillow at the time of the accident. I kept the splinter as a souvenir for a few weeks, but later threw it away as the horror of that night temporarily faded from my memory, and other events replaced it. Morning light brought additional horror to the accident scene. Contents of ripped and torn duffel bags littered the trackside, a glove picked up. It was not empty. The wrecked boxcars were removed from the tracks, replacements were secured, and we were on our way again. Of the 46 men in the 2 boxcars, there were but 20 survivors. There was no crowding for the rest of the trip. Along the way, we passed many groups of German graves. Mostly they were in small numbers, 5 to 10 each. Many still had helmets hanging from crosses or rifles used as head markers. We were surprised they were still there because this was North Africa, the land of the Arabs, which to many of us meant thieves. I had a surprise waiting for me at the Oran station. The lieutenant I had assisted at the train wreck was all right, at least fit enough to blow a whistle and tell everyone to keep moving. We arrived at our destination, a training camp just a few miles out of town. It was not a very nice place. It was a bad place. Our bodies are severely punished, our brains numbed by the constant repetition of orders. I spent 4 or 5 weeks at that hellish training camp outside Oran, located at the base of Lion Mountain. I came near to walking my feet off right to the knees, going up, down, and around that hunk of rock. I never saw such blisters as I saw on my feet at that time. Everyone else was as bad off as I. If the enemy had been able to observe us, they would have thought we were a regiment of walking wounded and attacked with little thought of danger. The only exciting event to happen was when there was an attack on our camp commander by 2 paratroopers. It seems our camp commander had been an officer in the paratroops. He screwed up a vital jump over Sicily, and many troopers were unnecessarily killed. These 2 paratroopers who had survived the vital jump intended to send the camp commander to where so many of their buddies had gone. They made a good attempt at it. They put a bullet in him, but it did not kill him. It was the second attempt to relieve him of the sins and worries of the world. Previously, a grenade was tossed into his tent. Unfortunately, he had prepared for this possible attempt on his life and had dug a slit trench under his cot. Luckily for him, he had been sober enough that night to sleep in it and not on the cot. I imagine those 2 paratroopers are still in jail somewhere. I also believe he is still drinking himself to sleep unless he has been fortunate enough to die. I could hardly believe it. I had been given a 1-day pass to Oran. Did that ever sound good? A chance to look up some of those fancy French ladies we heard were there. Do some sightseeing? Go to a bar in some crooked dark street. As it turned out, the only parts of that sinful city not off limits were churches, a small shopping area, the USO canteen, and parts of the dock area. All the above lined with tough-looking military police. About the most colorful sight to be remembered were 2 merchant seamen vomiting their agonizing way to adventures I could only imagine. A few days later, we were told to pack up and be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Being curious about what will be done with my only life, I asked where to. I should have known better. Chapter 6. Our next destination was to be Naples, Italy. The Mediterranean and I got along so well, I did not have the slightest twinge of nausea. If it were not for a submarine alert on our 3rd day at sea, I could say I really enjoyed the boat ride. To help pass the time away, almost every soldier on board made rings or medallions out of coins. All day long one would hear hammers tapping away. At the sound of the alarm, all motion stopped. Hammers stopped poised in mid-swing. Men using the latrine stared at each other unbelievingly. For a moment or two, the only thing that moved on that ship were our eyeballs, as we searched in vain for someone to tell us it was only a drill. It was not a drill, it was the real thing. Everyone burst into action. Officers were yelling at us to get down to our quarters. Terrified, we struggled with a gun crew on the one available ladder. As they, wild-eyed, tried to come up, we decided to go down. One gun crew member neglected to put on their pants and ran to his station in his undershorts in excitement. A gun crew on an adjoining ship accidentally fired their gun, hitting a lifeboat on our upper deck. I heard later that the flying splinters injured our ship's captain. A lot of the guys tried to stay on deck, but by this time the officers were waving guns at us. We were all herded down to our quarters and locked in. And, I mean locked in, an armed guard at the door and all. We were still milling around when a salvo of depth charges detonated near the ship. The explosion sent a shudder through the ship's structure. Paint from the ceiling fell to the deck like a light snowfall. Other explosions were heard but seemed further away. I was just plain scared. My mouth drained of all saliva, my tongue felt like a piece of wood, and I felt its roughness against my cheeks. Trickles of fear and sweat ran down my spine. Thankfully, the alert was soon over, and we could return to the open deck, wondrously happy to breathe fresh air again. A few of the men, once they were on deck, rushed for the rail and vomited. Happily, I was not one of them, but the strain of being locked in what seemed a steel coffin showed up in my behavior as soon as I went back to my ring-making. The first swing of my hammer hit me squarely on the thumb. I was told later that my cry of pain was so piercing several of the men around me thought another alarm had sounded. The real or alleged submarine attack was my first-hand encounter with the enemy. But later, as I stepped ashore in Naples, I felt the excitement of being in Italy. I was close to the enemy, or in a place at least where the night-bombing planes might fly over the spot I was standing on and attempt to destroy it and the ship. Chapter 7. Before my arrival and for several weeks here, my purpose in Italy was to serve as a truck mechanic. For 16 weeks, this is what the Army had trained me to do in basic training. Only 6 were spent training as a combat soldier. The remaining, like me, were trained for instruction at motor school. On May 23, 1944, the combined American and British Army broke out of the beachhead at Anzio, suffering more than the expected number of casualties, causing a distinct shortage of reinforcements available at that time in Italy. Orders came from Allied headquarters to press into combat all service personnel such as cooks, clerks, and, you guessed it, mechanics. After breakfast one day, we were marched out to a firing range and shown how to load and fire a .30 caliber air-cooled machine gun. Ammunition was in as short supply as reinforcements, and my total experience consisted of a 6-round burst. That evening, we were told to report to a tent crowded with office files and officers. As I spoke my name and serial number, a new service number was added to my records. Exit truck mechanic, enter machine gunner. You can believe this changeover put a brand new light on the situation for me. Being a replacement for a truck mechanic was one thing, but a machine gun replacement was something else. Thank God I was not called up right away and had time to prepare myself for this new, unexpected role. I learned that a machine gun section consisted of 2 ammo carriers, a loader who also carried the tripod, the gunner who carried the barrel, and the section leader who made sure everything was where it was supposed to be. The weapon and its uses were explained to me. I settled down to what life had to offer me in a replacement depot for an infantry division. From our camp area, we could see the flashes of heavy artillery at the battlefront every night and hear the summer storm thunder roll of exploding shells. Sometimes very faint, like a mouse running across a drum. Other times it was loud and clashing, like a drumstick dropped upon the drumhead. We were also close enough to Naples that on the many nights German planes bombed the city, we had a clear view of the action between the bombers and the searchlight beams and exploding anti-aircraft shells from the defending Allies. It was a spectacular and exciting sight, but not to be forgotten were the roles the two were playing. We were in a theater of war, and the actors were death and destruction. On one remembered night, the streams of tracers mixed with larger shells were climbing lazily into the sky when suddenly a German plane was caught and trapped in a crosshatch of searchlight beams. The trapped plane was tilting and twisting like a tormented animal, but although it broke clear of some of the beams, at least one hung on to it. As we watched, the bomber seemed to swell up very gently. It became a ball of burning gasoline, oil, and incendiary bombs, and it began to fall in pieces to the ground. Possibly the last seconds of life for those flyers? Yes, I think so, and I believe a person would have to be of sterner stuff than I not to be affected. Often we would hear the roar of our aircraft as they sped to assist the ground defenses. Every time these attacks on Naples occurred, we had to leave our tents and jump into the zigzag trenches dug by other replacements now in the thick of the fighting at Anzio. One raid, I remember, lasted well into early morning. As we were climbing out of our trench, one of our fighter planes came streaking over our area and performed a barrel roll. This was to let us know he had just shot down an enemy plane. One day we were taken out to climb what looked to me to be a small mountain. It was a tough climb, but not nearly as tough as it had been for the American soldiers who had to climb it in the face of enemy fire. That hill had been blasted to pieces. It was obvious even to we untried rookies that the devil had been unleashed that night. The action on that hill took place in October 1943. Almost 7 months had passed, but still, that hill was covered with the debris of war. There were other signs that heavy action had taken place in and around the immediate area. On an open field nearby were several shot-up tanks. American tanks were lined up facing German tanks. Some of them had so many holes in them they looked like Swiss cheese. I knew then I would never want to be assigned to the tanks. A good friend of mine, who I had been in high school, was, and he was killed. I wrote all about this to my girl back home, but the letter was returned to me by the censors. About the only thing left of my letter was "Hello, honey," and "Love, Joe." The day came when my number and others came up. Our turn had come to replace brave men who had gone before us. Actually, the news came as a relief from tension, expressed in various ways. 2 or 3 fist fights broke out. One guy in another area went to the extreme and blew off half a foot with an explosive. I just hoped that when the time came I would be up to it. I am sure many others felt the same way. In a surprisingly short time we were on our way. Our movement toward the fighting area took us past Rome, recently captured by the Allies. The Italians seemed extremely glad to see us and lined the roadside waving to us and wishing us good luck. One group threw roses at us. Unfortunately, one of them hit me alongside my left eye, drawing blood and later developing into a black eye. I was to see the St. Peter's Dome twice. That day on my way to war, and later through the window of an ambulance on my way home. Surprisingly, we did not go to a combat area at once. Instead, we were let off at a large town, large enough to have a gasoline station, a church of impressive size, and a very large plaza. We were told that this specific town was one of several built by the fascist government to impress visiting dignitaries. A canal ran alongside the field where we were to put up our tents. The surface of the ground undulated a good 2 or 3 feet. It wasn't easy to walk across, much less set up large 8-man tents. But we did it. While some were putting up tents, others were cleaning out a part of the canal for swimming. The contents of the canal were a story. A good portion of the retreating German army's equipment seemed to be at the bottom of it, along with the bodies of several Italians that had gotten in the way. It was easy to believe the information officer when he told us we were the first troops in the area, except the ones who had dislodged the Germans 3 days previously. Swimming in the canal offered us many hours of relaxation. The only drawback was the footpath running alongside the canal. It was a necessity used by the inhabitants every time they needed to go from one end of town to the other, and the nearest pair of swimming trunks was 100 miles away. Except for a few short hikes keeping us trim, we spent most of the time throwing the bull, wandering around looking for friends separated from us, or just lying in the sack waiting for the next meal or your number to be called again. In general, the people of the town were not too well off. We passed out sweaters, socks, and others we thought we could do without. At every meal, a gang of kids would hang around the trash cans, begging us to give them our leftovers. As often as not, many of us would not eat all we wanted rather than disappoint them. Occasionally, one of the idiots would save a tasty morsel and throw it to the poor kids to see them fight. Too soon, we were told to pack up and get ready to move out. And so, in this way, I continued my snail-like journey to glory.